Ellis is the next speaker. Chair.
On the face of it, this Fianna Fail motion says practically nothing. It certainly proposes very little. And what it does propose is either vague or very flawed. But the lack of any firm proposals in this motion speaks volumes. Fianna Fail, like the government, are incapable of grasping the reality that the crisis we face in housing, and particularly social housing, has now reached epidemic proportions. They are incapable of talking about the real solutions because, like the government, they are utterly opposed to them. Like the government, they are completely wedded to the model they carved out in the early 2000s to dismantle state provision of housing and move all responsibility onto the private sector and voluntary housing bodies and away from local authorities. Fianna Fail cannot really propose solutions because, like the government, their policies are more of the same. Under Fianna Fail, the primary way new applicants for social housing would get housed was through the use of a public subsidy of private accommodation, coupled with large discounts for council tenants to buy their homes and reliance on disastrous PPP models. The local authority housing stock was chopped and chopped again. There was a steep decrease in the delivery of major social housing projects and the use of regeneration projects, which delivered more private units where council houses once stood. Even back in the mid-2000s, it was clear there was a major problem with provision of social housing, with tens of thousands of applicants waiting months and years to be housed. We didn't realise how bad things would get, but it was clear from the policy of the time they were not getting better. Due to the failure of Fianna Fail to regulate the banks and their utter capitulation to Europe, we were left with a bailout programme that required serious financial readjustments. Unfortunately, with right-wing governments like Fianna Fail or Fine Gael, these adjustments tend always to be about squeezing from those who have little to give. In Fianna Fail's last few years of government, housing became a major target for cuts. Fine Gael kept up the tradition, and now we have a yearly housing capital spend over €1 billion short of the spend in 2008. This year, the government had the audacity to herald on high an announcement they would spend just over twice the 2008 housing budget over a period of 6 years. As you might expect, when you pick these numbers apart, much like this motion, it is very short of anything approaching a solution. Fianna Fail may have no solutions to the housing crisis, but neither does the government. The government does do one thing very well when it comes to housing, though, and that is spin. They've shown themselves to be masters at moving the goalposts and twisting figures. I can't count how many times government officials have announced the same figures and pretended they were new figures. In the early days of this government, it seemed like every few months we were told NAMA would deliver 4,000 homes, as if it was new information or even touching inaccurate. At present, they have only delivered a quarter of that, and they only did it once. Now we have the government shouting to anyone that will listen that they will spend €3.8 billion on housing in the next 6 years. That's €630 million a year on average, which is about €34 million more than was spent last year. 2014, if you weren't paying attention, was not the year that the housing crisis was solved. It was the year homelessness reached record highs. Housing need didn't budge, and we spent an additional €500 million on private rented subsidies for good measure. We also spent millions renting hostels and hotel rooms for families we couldn't be bothered to build houses for. The government did produce its Housing Strategy 2020 in 2014, though. This is the strategy which pledged that extra €34 million a year and claimed it would deliver 35,000 houses. Of course, deliver is a somewhat vague term. From where will these houses be delivered? Well, according to the Minister's responses from recent PQs, they will be delivered from thin air in a lot of cases, brought into being by wishful thinking and more of the same. When I asked the Minister much of the 7,400 homes he has promised for 2015 will be delivered by local authorities, I was told about 2,400. Somehow this government believes in the midst of the greatest shortage of residential rental properties in recent memory, when construction is still very low, they will find 5,000 new rental properties on the private market. I'm very interested to know how they will do that. I know there are a lot of people who can't find even a room in Dublin. Adverts go up and the vacancy filled within hours. People are so desperate, they are taking apartments for extortionate rents without even viewing them. The Minister needs to be clear about how they intend to deliver this housing and the extra cost of all this private subsidy will incur. Sinn Féin have been clear from the very start of the crisis. The problem is a shortage of social housing, and the only solution is more social housing. The private market is unable or unwilling to provide housing to large sections of our society in any kind of stable way, and the state has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that its people have access to affordable, secure and comfortable housing. The money now pledged for the government strategy must be redirected for investment in building social housing. The only policy difference Fianna Fail offers here is one which simply does not stack up. Increasing rent supplement levels by removing the cap would simply drive up rents further, while providing no security for the vast majority of people at threat due to the high rents or unable to find housing within the range of the cap. In autumn of 2014, the average rent in Dublin, where a huge number of rent supplements reside, is €1,296. The average rent for a double room is €518. The problem is not with rates of rent supplement or the caps in many cases, but simply that rents are impossibly high, not just for the unemployed who are eligible for rent supplement, but single people with no dependents and low and middle incomes. The average rent supplement payment last year was €4,400 a year. That is the average for about 75,000 people. A 10% increase in rent supplement payments would cost about €32 million and would do very little to protect recipients from eviction. It would simply further line the pockets of landlords. The removal of the cap or its increase will probably push up prices. It would also see many people on rent supplement be forced to pay even more in their own contribution, leaving less for food and utilities. Throwing more money at private rents only serves the landlords, but of course many landlords sit in this House, so there is no surprise that this might be popular. In the absence of a major increase in social housing, this policy would be disastrous. At best, it would be a costly exercise in distraction. The solution to the rents crisis is to introduce a system of rent control in conjunction with a major campaign of building social housing through local authorities. Rents must be regulated. It cannot be allowed to be so strongly controlled by the whim of private developers and landlords, who are reaping the rewards of a housing shortage and extorting inexcusably high rents out of struggling families and working people. Rent control would set a guide level for accommodation based on location and quality, which could be tailored to reflect changes in the economic climate, the cost of living and inflation. There is no excuse for rises in rents, which amount to 40% in 1 year. Rent control would ensure that rent control never fall below what is reasonably or rise below what is affordable. It is essential that housing is affordable for the public. Any claims that rent control would be unconstitutional are clearly wrong based on any fair-minded reading of the relevant articles of Bunrock na hÉireann. 7 years after they presided over an unprecedented property crash, we still have Fianna Fail railing against financial regulation. They have learned nothing. Imagine we were back in 2005 and we had a central bank proposing an end to 100% mortgages. Fianna Fail would be, like they are now, up in arms. They are very slow learners. Their instinct for opposing regulation is shown again during this episode. Fianna Fail can't be trusted when it comes to regulation, and especially when issues like property are being discussed. The bubble in both residential and commercial property was down in large part to a failure in regulation. It is depressing to hear the party that oversaw that bubble and did its best to reduce regulation once again attack proposals that bring some sense into the property market. The rich and those with rich families will always be able to outbid others. What creates bubbles and forces workers out of the housing market is excessive and unregulated credit. In our proposal, Sinn Féin welcomed the broad thrust of the Central Bank's original proposals. There has been much concern during the public discussions about how these rules will affect young families trying to buy in particular. Sinn Féin shared that concern. The reason young families and young workers can't save is due to the low-wage economy this government is building. It is because young workers cannot make ends meet, and that's before water charges even come in. It is because even when it has some space to give something back, this government brought in a budget that favoured only the top 40% better off and made the rest, the majority, poorer. We have, at the end of the third quarter of last year, 117,000 family homes in arrears on their family home. That is 15.5% of all family homes. Many of them are working families. But when a bank that can borrow money from the ECB at 1 or 2% are charging them 4 or 5% interest, then they cannot afford their mortgage. That doesn't concern this government, though. They act like Pontius Pilate and ignore the fact that they own some of these banks. Sinn Féin have drafted legislation that would give the financial regulator the final say as to whether interest rate hikes are justifiable at state-owned banks. When this government first came to power, they huffed and they puffed when the banks increased their rates. But now they hide under the table with their hands over their ears. The central bank are doing their job. The government should start doing theirs. Homelessness and families now in homelessness. The big problem we have now is families now coming into homelessness with a huge hemorrhage from rental supplement and RAS. People are ending up in a homeless situation. They're ending up in hostels and B&Bs. Some of them are dragging their kids across the city. They don't know where they're going to end up, and they end up with huge financial costs as well as the social consequences of those. Prices are heading back to Celtic Tiger era. Have we learned nothing from it? Last night I visited a house in Whitehall. The tenant with her children had to sleep downstairs in a 3-bedroom house. The dampness, mildew and conditions were so serious that all their healths were under serious threat. They were sleeping actually downstairs because I went upstairs and I couldn't breathe when I walked in the room. These are the conditions of some of the houses that we've seen, and we've seen it in central Dublin. When there was a survey done by the local authorities, we saw the amount of houses that were below standard when they were visited. It's a calamity, the amount of houses that are not up to standard. The rules and regulation in regards to landlords and their responsibilities are not being enforced. I know we brought more new rules in and we give more power, but it is still not enough. People who complain are sometimes even served with a notice, as in the case I've just mentioned. That person was served with a notice with several children and herself. That's what we're facing. The mortgage to rent need issue needs to be reviewed. There has been a very small take-up, but it is a necessary step. And now, because the house values have gone over 200,000, we are told that we can't deal with it. You're not suitable for the mortgage to rent. I think it's scandalous. We now need to look at that and revisit it. Housing should be a right. It should be enshrined in our Constitution. Minister, we need to invest in housing with an immediate stimulus. £1 billion should be taken from the Strategic Investment Fund. And that, it didn't bother us taking over 500 million from the Pension Reserve Fund to put into meters that we have absolutely no need for. We didn't have a problem doing that. But there is money there in the Strategic Investment Fund. And I know the Minister has mentioned that he's going to use some of that money. I welcome that, because I've been saying this for years, that money is there, because we put PQ after PQ to find out. That money needs to be invested. We need to do it immediately and get things up and running, because we all know if we start building now, it will take a year, year and a half to 2 years before we deliver. And that's one of the problems that we face. We need to act now. It is, in my opinion, it is clear we are moving back in a similar laxative manner that put us in this position with the housing.
Thank you.
Thank you.